a personal message. I just want to thank all the people who did make a submission about the powers. It's a bit difficult now, but if you want to try and reserve the aeroplanes, just send me an email to tomlockley@gmail.com and I'll send them on, send it on. But the situation's pretty dire. Anyway, let's get on with the meeting itself. Thank you very much for all turning up. I'm really highly delighted.
Welcome. Just before I begin, I just want to mention that some slides have far too much print on them for to be read in this presentation. I've left them there because I noticed that on Peter's wonderful website, lots of people are replaying submissions that have been made to that site, and if you want to read the detail, then I suggest that you have another look at it and pause when necessary to read the far too much print that is there. Anyway, let's proceed. I'm going to start this story by talking about the Royal Naval Air Service. Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, was keen on developing an air arm, and the Naval Air Service was officially started in mid-1914, and you can see here one of the training aircraft, a Bristol box kite, and the British public got quite used to reading tales of daring do by their brave RNS pilots, often in seaplanes, and the seaplanes at the beginning of the war were usually Shorts. Short brothers in Harland, who had a distinguished career, of course, in flying boats, as long as flying boats were popular. But also the Naval Air Service had squadrons which flew on land, both fighter and bomber squadrons. And the relevance of this is that Goebel and McIntyre, the protagonists more or less of the Fairey story, came from this background to Australia to establish the Royal Australian Air Force. Another thing that I'm going to do, just to introduce this topic, is to talk about seaplanes before the Fairies. Of course, the first seaplane to fly in Australia was Levius Horden's Farman in Sydney in May 1914, flown by Maurice Guyot. Then the war came, and during the war, a couple of the Australian cruisers carried spotter aeroplanes for short periods of the war. After the war, Levius Horden again entered the field. This is something I didn't know until recently, with purchase of 4 seaplanes. They did coastal surveys, and actually one of them went to New Guinea. They had quite a story. I'm going to try and develop that for another short talk some other time. But the Horden seaplanes created a lot of media attention. How did we come to get the seaplanes? Well, basically, it was a captain's call by the then Prime Minister, Billy Hughes, who was still in Britain, dealing with the peace settlement. And he ordered a number of them and settled on 6 aircraft for $23,000. The first was accepted in August 1921 and named Mary by Mrs. Hughes herself. They were sent to Australia. C.R. Fairey left short seaplanes at the beginning of the war, and first of all produced this amazing looking aircraft, but gradually settled down to producing a line of single-engined biplane fighters, usually seaplanes. And the Fairey III, at the end of the war, was the most successful of these. the Fairey III didn't really take much part in the war itself, but did fight in the war against the Bolsheviks in Russia, and incidentally preferred cold climates such as around Archangel to the Australian heat. But this slide makes the point that they're quite big aircraft. Compare the Tiger. So the Fairey III was produced for about 12 years, and we have the Fairey III which came to Australia, and the last of the line, the Fairey Seal. And you can see the basic difference of streamlining. This is a table of specifications, and you can see that in terms of height, weight, etc., they were very similar. The main difference was the engine. The first Fairys had Sunbeam in Marie engines. They were replaced for the 3D by the Rolls-Royce Eagle engine, the same engine that was in the Vickers Vimy of Smith. And then as time went on, they were replaced by various engines, the most successful of which being the 570 horsepower Napier Lion, which boosted the maximum speed most considerably. One of the problems with the Rolls-Royce Eagle was that it was hard to install neatly, and the 3D you can see in pictures has various bits of engine sticking out the side of the engine nacelle. Not very elegant. The arrival of the Fairey IIIs corresponded fairly closely with the establishment of the Royal Australian Air Force. The basis of the RAF was the Imperial Gift of 1919. Australia received 128 aircraft in total, but they were all land planes. 100 were a straight gift of surplus aeroplanes after the war, and 28 were to replace aircraft which had been donated by Australians during the war. Now, as you all know, Richard Williams was the head of the Air Force, the father of the Air Force all the way through. And Goebel, who we'll find out quite a lot about shortly, was his number two. Williams was supported by the Army and Goebel by the Navy. Seems a logical sort of argument, except for one little problem. They hated each other. The objective and normally staid Australian Dictionary of Biography says, it quickly became an established practice to ensure that these two officers served as little together as possible. You'll find that the main development of the seaplanes occurred while Williams was overseas doing a staff course. The pissing competition was clearly won by Williams. In World War II, he still dominated the scene, whereas Goebel was palmed off to look after the Empire Air Training Cadets in Canada. But I'd like to talk a bit more about him. Like Williams, he came from a middle-class background. He joined the Victorian Railways at age 16 and 7 years later was relieving station master, fairly senior, with particular skill in Morse code, which was a great help to him when he joined the Air Force later on. He was refused entry into the Australian Army because of health reasons, so he paid his own way to England and joined the Royal Naval Air Service. He took part in the Dover Patrol and then went to Dunkirk as fighter pilot, scored his first victory, and became quite a successful fighter pilot, notably over the Battle of the Somme, and received a couple of awards for bravery. He went to 8th Squadron Royal Naval Air Service and again continued his great work, and this time as a bomber flying de Havillands. He won great praise for his fighting retreat during the Germans' last attack during the war, when they tried to win the war before the Americans came. When the RAF was established, of course, he joined that and finished the war as Major, with an OBE added to his other military awards. Williams, by the way, was Lieutenant Colonel at this time. There wasn't a lot of money lying around when the aircraft arrived, so only one was erected, and that was A-10-1 Mary. And the first pilot was Hippolyte Ferdinand de la Rue. His nickname was Kanga. Again, a middle-class person who had a very successful war, and was the only person capable of flying the seaplane, so he took it for a few flights when it was assembled in 1921. He stayed on and was retired from the Air Force's Air Commodore in April 1946. In 1923, this fellow arrived from England, Ivor McIntyre. Had a distinguished wartime career and was instrumental in bringing the ferries into active service. Here's the pilot of the Round Australia flight, but we'll talk about briefly shortly. He's the only person to be awarded, I'll say that again, he is one of the few people to be awarded more than one Oswald Watt medal, and he actually flew Williams around the Pacific, as we'll talk about later. He left the Air Force in 1927, and 6 months later he is killed in a crash in a Cirrus Moth while flying for the South Australian Aero Club. There's a really excellent biography of him on the South Australian Aviation website. Well, A-10 had an interesting sort of career. It conducted the first trials in aerial marine survey. Flew from Point Cook to Sydney on one day, which was quite an achievement in 1923. Made a tour to Newcastle, did some work at Jervis Bay, and had quite an interesting career for only a year, until on 18th of August 1924 it was crashed. The crew was killed, and the only recognisable part of any Fairey that we've got is A-10-1's number plate, F394, which is in the Point Cook Museum. A-10-2 and the other aircraft were assembled in about 1923. They were used in some sort of vague exercise to train observers. And A-10-2 also did some exploratory work in survey work in Sydney Harbour. It made the first crossing of the Bass Strait in a seaplane, took part in the 1924 Hobart Regatta, and the publicity for the flight stressed the use of the radio to keep in contact with Point Cook, quite an achievement. It took part in the Barrier Reef survey, as we'll see, and in 1925 crashed and was killed and was destroyed. A typical thing that the early aircraft did was take part in ceremonial activities, like this flight over the British fleet that was led by HMS Hood, sunk by the Bismarck later on, that visited Melbourne in 1924. The ferries were often brought out for ceremonial occasions like this. They didn't do a lot of flying otherwise. Just introduce you quickly to another pilot, Pard Mustar. He wasn't. His father was a labourer. He went to war, was a signaller at Gallipoli, joined 1 Squadron Royal Flying Corps. He flew with Ross Smith. He became a pilot and very successful and fearless. Came to Australia in 1919 and joined the RAAF in 1922. Took part in the survey of Lake Eyre in 1922 and in the Barrier Reef, as we'll hear shortly, and left the Air Force shortly thereafter and acquired an amazing reputation in New Guinea, which is beyond the scope of this story. He returned and became the Managing Director of Australian Transcontinental Airways, served in the RAF in World War II and retired as Group Captain. Fascinating character. His name was Mustard, but when in the late 20s he got married, his wife said, "I don't like this," so he dropped the D off the end of the name. If you haven't read his story, it's well worth exploring. So, of course, the main achievement of the Fairys was the Round Australia flight of 1924. A10-3 was chosen for this because it had only done about 20 hours on its engine. I am going to inflict on you, or those people who will listen, the story of the Round Australia flight about this time next year, but it was quite an achievement. So, start on the 6th of April, finish on the 19th of May, a couple of engine changes and all sorts of other events on the way, but that's for next year. It's very sad what happened to A10-3. It did take part in the Barrier Reef survey, but the Round Australia flight had created a huge amount of interest, and so it was decided that this aircraft would be a historic one and was withdrawn from service and donated to the Australian War Museum. It was exhibited all over the place and was very, very popular. But in 1929, the AWM trustees decided that the aircraft didn't meet their criteria because it hadn't served during the war. So it was dismantled, and last was heard of it was stored in Victoria Barracks, but there's no trace of it now, which is very sad. Some more flights. Another typical one, A10-5, piloted by McIntyre, located the visiting US fleet in very bad weather off Gabo Island, and the RAF was absolutely delighted because the Americans were amazed that aircraft flew in this weather. It was a huge fleet visit and a great follow-up from the Great White Fleet before the war. So there are 3 aircraft towards the end of the service with the RAAF. I'm going to give a bit of a call out to leading aircraftman and later Sergeant George Goschalk. I believe he weighed 14 or 15 stone, but nevertheless he is the prime choice of the aviators when they wanted to carry with them a good mechanic. He took a prominent part in the Round Australia flight and in the Barrier Reef surveys, left the RAF in 1925, worked in aviation fields and also in New Guinea. A fascinating character and a reminder that it's not always the high-ranking officers that are important in a squadron. Apart from the Round Australia flight, the Fairys are most known for the Barrier Reef surveys. There were 2 seasons, 1924 and 1925, of surveying. They produced some great results and also developed many skills. Their base was HMAS Geranium. Geranium was sent to Australia, one of 3 mine sweepers, to clear the German mines that had been dropped in various places in Australia and New Zealand during the war. There weren't too many mines to be cleared, but the ships were handed over to Australia, and Geranium was commissioned as a survey vessel in 1920. It was very serviceable, but made for cold climates and not very good in the tropics, but apart from that it worked well. It was decommissioned in 1927 and scrapped, sunk off Sydney Heads in 1935. A10-3 was the first aircraft to be taken north, and it actually travelled on Geranium, but all the other aircraft were either flown or carried on coastal steamers, and as time went on there was more transport by coastal steamers than direct flights. So, as I said, 2 seasons of surveying. I don't know where this photo came from, but it's certainly very evocative. I thought it might be taken from another ship, but I've worked out that the davits which were used for raising the aircraft were swung out to have this person on it. They surveyed quite an amount of country, and the aviators' work is still celebrated by the naming of Mustard Patches, Swinburne Patches. He was another prominent pilot of the Fairies, and Ralph Scholes. Townsville was the shore base for much of the 1924 surveying period. You can see that it's not very big, and an assessment made of the aircraft points out the fact that they were useful. They increased the safety of the sloop when working within the reef. Ralph Scholes I've been able to locate. Here's Kansas in the top right-hand corner of this map, and Ralph Scholes is, or more or less in the bottom left-hand corner, about 60 kilometres out of Cairns. A few later flights. This one really intrigues me. In 1925, A10-5 and A10-6 took part in the Hobart Regatta, and their headline act was simulated torpedo attacks on the visiting Japanese 10,000-ton Izumo-class destroyer HIJMS, His Imperial Japanese Majesty's ship, Iwate. In view of later events, it's fascinating to think that the Australians showed off by attacking the Japanese with their mock torpedo attacks. Another interesting thing about this attack was McIntyre flew with A.T. Cole, who became Air Vice Marshal Adrian Lindley Trevor Cole, DSO, MC, DFC, and A10-5 was flown by Jonathan Ross of the RAN, and his observer was later to be known as Sir Peter Drummond, KCB, DSO and Bar, OBE, MC, RAF Air Marshal during World War II, who took a prominent part in the North African War. Iwate was a very old ship there, and then it antedated the Battle of Toshima, and it was sunk by American bombers in the closing days of World War II. A10-6. Now, here's a bit of riddle. During the period 1925 to 1927, A10-4, 5 and 6 regularly rotated between Point Cook and Eden, New South Wales, to provide fleet support for the RAN. A detachment of up to 3 aircraft was based at Eden for varying durations during this period. Why? There are no pictures in the newspapers, there are no stories, there's no RAN base near Eden, there's no mention of it in the local museum. I wonder whether they weren't spotting whales, and that's not fashionable these days, but I'd be interested to know what on earth they were doing, because it was a large proportion of the aircraft flying during those few years. Another flight from Melbourne to Launceston, checking on emergency landing grounds for a proposed passenger and mail service. But the days of the ferries were numbered. They did very useful work, but the main problem was the floats, which were very fragile and needed constant attention. And the Walrus, with its flying boat hull, I'll do that again, the Seagull III with its flying boat hull was far more reliable, more rugged. They arrived in Australia in about June 1926 and were immediately sent north to take over the Barrier Reef survey. The ferries were listed on the RWS strength as trainers, but they seldom flew because they were getting pretty worn out. There weren't a lot of spare parts, and other aircraft was available. They were in such bad condition that the Air Force decided that they couldn't be sold. They were dismantled, and the remains of them was burnt. And about the same time, Geranium was replaced by HMAS Moresby, which stayed in action till about 1952, as did the successors to the Seagull, including the Walrus. Just an interesting sidelight. When Williams returned from his staff college work in England after the round Australia flight by Goebel, he himself did a couple of long distance flights, and the WikiLeaks people, who seem to be rather biased towards Goebel, say that he did it because he is jealous of Goebel's success. But regardless of that, flown by McIntyre, which is interesting, he made a flight out of Australia to the Solomon Islands and to New Guinea, and then a flight around Australia, and they used a DH-50A. There are only two DH-50s imported. This one was supposed to be the Governor-General's aircraft, but Williams used it for this flight, and from all reports it was very reliable in comparison with the Fairey, which flew around Australia. There were a few ferries in the New Zealand Air Force, one of which was a Mark 3B, used as a seaplane, only one. It was used more or less for rescue and flying doctor work for a little while. And at the beginning of the war, New Zealand received 47 Fairey Gordons, which are radial engined Fairey IIIs, land planes, and they were ostensibly for the defence of New Zealand and written up as still modern aircraft. Heaven help New Zealand if the Japanese had invaded. They were used for trainers until 1943 and were all destroyed, but I understand at least one is being restored now. The Fairey III was the predecessor of a whole series of naval Fairey aircraft. Of course, the most famous of that and the immediate successor is the Swordfish. Was a frontline aircraft for all of World War II. I believe it made the first attack on a U-boat at the beginning of the war and the last attack on a U-boat at the end of the war, but that might be stretching a little bit. The ostensible successor to the Fairey was the Albacore. You can see it's got a far more sophisticated looking aircraft with a nice enclosed cabin, but it didn't meet with the approval of the crews and actually went out of service before the Swordfish did. Another aircraft from the 1940s was the Barracuda. Came into quantity production in about 1943, made some attacks on the Tirpids. A couple of squadrons came to Australia with the British Pacific Fleet. Didn't like the hot weather, as happened with many other aircraft of the time. The Fairey IV, a naval three-seat fighter and reconnaissance aircraft, did some great work in the defence of Malta. The Fairey V, distinguished service in HMAS Sydney and I think in Melbourne. A very capable aircraft, could carry a couple of tons of bombs actually, and very rugged. About the only naval aircraft that the British produced that was up to the standards of the Americans in terms of ruggedness anyway. And the final one in the series, of course, the Gannet, anti-submarine warfare aircraft, which went out of service in about 1967. Sadly, there's only one surviving Fairey III. It's in the Naval Museum at Lisbon in Portugal. The Fairys were the first aircraft to cross the South Atlantic from Portugal to the Cape Verde Islands to a rocky outcrop just off the north of South America. And the first aircraft, the Lusitania, flew to this rocky outcrop, and while it was being filled, it sank, which was a bit of a pity. So they decided that they'd send out another aircraft which would complete the flight. But at the same place, it also sank because of the rough weather and other problems. So a third aircraft was flown out. Well, it was shipped out, and it actually completed the flight to Brazil, and so it is preserved to commemorate the first flight across the South Atlantic, and it's wonderful that it is. It's an early Model 3 with the Eagle engine and the rectangular tail, which was a feature of the early seaplane, the early Fairys. So we're coming up to the centenary. What will happen? Well, there's already a few preliminary steps to do something about philately. We'll see what happens there. The first flight had no commemorative stamp and no mail was carried. The Pals Boys magazine produced some sticker stamps, Cinderellas, commemorating the flight, and was part of the general celebration of the flight. The block that you can see there sold for $1,500 in the year 2009. It'd probably get quite a lot now. And in 1994 there was a series of aviator stamps, including this one with Goebel and McIntyre. So I don't know what is going to happen in 2024, but I do hope the flight is commemorated. Michael Smith, who did the celebration of the Smith flight of 1918-1919, said at one stage that he hoped to fly around Australia more or less keeping to the timetable of Goebel and Williams, and he'd welcome, if that happened, it'd be great to have some other aircraft taking part, but we'll see. Thanks very much for listening. If you've got more information or you'd like references for facts stated, or to chew the matter over in any shape or form, particularly if you've got corrections, because I know that there are a couple of errors in what I've said.
No, I'm sorry, I chopped off the last 10 seconds by accident, but just a plea for knowledge and a plea for forgiveness. I noticed that I moved a couple of centuries. I had 2024 there, and instead of 1924, and made a couple of other errors, but thanks for staying awake and listening. And I hope it was of minor interest. And I do hope something happens in 2024 because it was an amazing feat. He got the Britannia medal for the Britannia trophy for, or they got the Britannia trophy for the most outstanding feat of the year throughout the British Empire. And the hardships that they endured were amazing, mainly because they had to land in the bays and put up with tides going up and down, and virtually had to nurse the aircraft 24 hours a day. There's a couple of interesting sidelights about their interaction with the Aboriginal people, which indicate how much we've come. So I do hope that it's commemorated, but I hope to do the history of it for about this time next year. So thanks very much for listening, people, and over to you.
Thank you, Tom. That was really, really interesting.
Thank you, Tom.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Tom.
Tom, just a question, or maybe a comment, really, I suppose.
Yeah.
That Fairey III in the museum, it didn't seem to have the float under the rear of the tail.
Good question, and I hadn't noticed that. I won't try and go back to it. With my record of technology, it wouldn't work. That's interesting, isn't it? Really, the float under the tail is a sort of ugly-looking thing, isn't it? You know, it's the more modern aircraft don't have it, and yes, they have longer floats, exactly.
Mm.
But there's certainly there doesn't seem to be. I'll start that again. The seagulls and later the walrus amphibians seem to have had far, far less trouble. Goebel and McIntyre on their trip around Australia were all the time repairing the floats and bailing them out so that they could just take off. And when they landed, they were immediately pumping out the floats again. Certainly, the seaplane configuration is far stronger. And when you look at the modern seaplanes, they're all, at least, I'm sorry, the flying boat configuration is stronger. And when you look at the modern flying boats, the Sea Ray and so on, they're all flying boat configuration, aren't they?
Tom, in regard to Gottschalk, the mechanic, do we know what happened to him after 1927?
Yes, I do now. I do remember.
1937, I meant.
37. He didn't take part in the war. And I should know because I chased up his funeral notice. I am pretty sure that he died in 1939. It's a bit annoying. Gottschalk did some remarkable things, but the glamour sort of goes to the flyers. And even though he got them out of trouble on numerous occasions, the sort of engineer type in the Air Force didn't get the recognition. So I tried to chase his story up, and it took me a long time on Trove to do it. Whereas if you take people like Williams, you just go to the Australian Dictionary of Biography and it's all there. I'm pretty sure that he died in 1939. Parnell, who wrote the main story of the flight that's readily available, says that the Eagle engine was a wonderful engine. Well, I don't think so, because, virtually every time you turn around, the jolly thing conks out and you've got to land and change a valve or do something. And he certainly performed some remarkable repairs en route. Well, thanks very much, people. It's I'm honoured that we had so many people, because I was very worried about it. And from the technology point of view, my apologies about that. Pinado, when he landed in Sydney, in Melbourne and Sydney, created a lot of stir with his aircraft, even though it had only the same size engine as the Eagle. But the newspaper Truth, which, as you know, was anything but the truth, really lambasted the RAAF for flying such terrible aircraft when Pinado had this quite streamlined flying boat. And the article is typical of truth. It's quite. I had it in, and can I tell you one more story? In fact, I'll ask a question. Does anyone know? This will test the New South Wales people to see if they've been reading their southern skies. Does anyone? So New South Wales people, be quiet for a moment. Does anyone know the first time an aircraft flew from a ship to attack a shore target? No? Okay, New South Wales people, did you read your southern skies? It was the Japanese. At the end of 1914, the Japanese attacked Tsingtao in China, and they had a seaplane carrier with Farmans, which conducted bombing raids on Tsingtao. So despite the fact that the Royal Naval Air Service regards it as the pioneers, the Japs beat them to it, which I think is another gentle irony.
Tom, George Lancelot
Yes.
died at Catherine on the 12th of August 1939.
Yep.
He was driving from Darwin to
That's
Melbourne
right.
at the time via Adelaide.
Mm-hmm. And he died not of a road accident, he just died, I think.
Yeah.
He was involved in a lot of, sorry, I'll rephrase that. He's involved in some route planning for the airlines in the 30s.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thanks for that. I was right with the 1939 death. Hey, the easiest way, if you do want to do something at this stage, is probably to send me an email and I'll send it on. The official time for consultation has, in theory, closed, but you can get you can get through to the official consultation. The big problem is they had the consultation and everyone says, "Oh, please don't pull out the steam gallery, don't pull out the aircraft engines, don't destroy the RAN building." And then they simply produced a plan and said, "We've consulted and we're going to do it anyway." So can I ask a question of everybody? And this is just for the record. Is there anyone here who thinks it's a good idea to take the technology out of the powerhouse and take the aeroplanes out of the powerhouse? Speak now or forever hold your peace. Okay, so I reserve the right to say I was at a meeting which had people from New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland, and people were unanimous in thinking it was a stupid idea.
Yeah.
Okay, so thanks for your support. We've got to win this one. I mean, it's bloody criminal. But anyway, as I said, I really appreciate all the people that came. It's really wonderful, and I hope I can. Levius Horton is a fascinating character. I hope that if we're still short of speakers, I can do something about his career as an aircraft owner. It didn't last very long. He metaphorically crashed and burnt, not in an aeroplane, but in about 1925. He really had a bad time. And then this time next year, the Global Round Australia flight. If you Google at the film archive, Global Round Australia flight, there's a very interesting short video which shows the Fairey in flight and an interesting graphic of how he flew around Australia. So, thanks very much, people. That's really, really great.
Just before we go,
Yeah.
a little while ago, Tsingtao was mentioned. For those who don't know, Tsingtao was a German equivalent of Hong Kong.
Yeah.
It was a German colony on the edge of China, a fair bit north, and they had a German Pacific fleet there, of which the Emden was one of the ships. When World War I broke out, they more or less scattered. Most of them went southeast across the Pacific, ended up with the Battle of the Falklands and other places down around South America. But Tsingtao beer still exists. They had a German brewery there. They still do.
I'm sure it's good. Yeah. And the Germans had, I think, only one aircraft. which to defend the place, but they did have an air defence. So it was the first battle of the first time that type of action took place, and the Japanese got very good at it, as we saw in December 1941, didn't we?
Mhm.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen and ladies. It's been a great evening, and I've really enjoyed it, and I hope you have too.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot,
Tom.
Tom. Really,
Thank
really
you,
good.
Tom. Thank you, Tom. Bye.
Thanks, Tom. Good.